So today I want to talk about emotions, and I think, I was a little bit concerned before I arrived that I'm going to focus a little bit on advertising. Obviously the conference is about robotics, but something that seems to be becoming really clear, given the interest in deception, given the interest in lying, misleading. Advertising might not be a bad topic for us to get into. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about exactly what emotional AI is. I'm going to discuss this notion of empathic technologies, but I'm also going to provide some empirical data as well regarding how people feel about these technologies, and also give you a sense of some use cases as well. Possibly that's been a little bit missing so far. So let's go along and let's see where we get to. So in terms of definitions, in terms of what emotional AI is, in short, it's based on weak AI. There is no such thing as strong AI. So this idea that machines are somehow going to have kind of real intelligence in any kind of way that a human would understand it is not true, and in the foreseeable future is not going to be true either. Rather, AI in this context is based on something which is much more narrow, which is something much more task-driven. So in relation to technologies that kind of interact with kind of human affects in terms of physiological states and that make inferences about human emotion, empathic technologies are these. They're those which theorize, they make inferences about emotions, feelings, moods, perspective, intention, attention. So I think it might be interesting to perhaps later to get into this question of whether of kind of necessary deception, as Gianpaolo was discussing. But in terms of, is this a thing? Are technologies that interact with human emotion, are they a thing? And I think yes is the short answer, but I think as we look forward, I think as in terms of thinking about AIs as they interact with people, I think until they're sensitive to feelings, emotions, and human intention, they are going to be somewhat limited. So this idea of kind of technologies kind of interacting with emotion, it sounds a little far-fetched. But if we're thinking about kind of AIs interacting with people, they have to be able to infer. That doesn't necessarily mean understand in any kind of human way, but it does mean the ability to theorize and understand. So in terms of the use cases of emotional AI and empathic technologies, here's just a few to get us going. There's a lot more that we could talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about advertising. Cars, huge area. Data brokers, huge area. Education, again, a really interesting area in terms of use of everything from EEG cameras, etc., in classrooms. I'll pick up a couple more. Policing is a particularly interesting one, not just in terms of use of surveillance on citizens, but also tracking police officers' emotional and embodied reactivity to stressful situations that they might face. And clearly robotics, given that we're interested in human-machine interactions, emotions, sensing of emotions is clearly going to be pretty important. So in terms of how this works, these are a variety of sensing approaches, focusing much less on sentiment analysis today, which is kind of to sense language, emojis, and video for sentiment, for tone in media content. Facial coding seems to be the one that's captured attention of late. There's a lot of articles floating around on the web arguing that kind of facial coding is debunked, it's flawed, etc., etc. And we can get into some of those questions when we get into the questions maybe. I think voice analytics is perhaps one of the key ones that we really need to be paying aware of, because when we think about voice, emotion and voice detection is much more reliable, but I think if we consider what we hold in our hands, the objects that we have in our homes in terms of voice assistants, I think voice is going to be a really big one. Amazon and many other companies basically just kind of refining the emotion sensing in voice. I think this is one that was going to have a tipping point and exponential scaling pretty quickly. Wearables, of course, another. But just to stick with facial coding for a moment, in terms of how it works, how the learning element of this works, essentially it's just about sensing of physiological signals, and extracting features from faces. Of course, that could be bodies, it could be respiration data, it could be heart rate data, etc., etc. But in short, it's about physiological sensing, it's about extracting features, it's about using algorithms to classify those features into a clustered or pre-named emotion, which, we can get to the methodology about this later, and then outputting some emotion classification of some sort that is subsequently acted upon by a given device or a given machine. So in terms of use cases, when I first started the research in this area, I started working in this area around kind of 2013, 2014. And the investigation was kind of largely philosophical at that stage. And then I did around kind of 100 interviews with kind of companies around the world working in this area, did some survey work, which I'll talk about later. But in short, while I was getting into this, it was startups, kind of spinning up out of universities, kind of trying to play around with some kind of the kooky things that kind of computer scientists were inventing. We're a few years later now, 5, 6 years later, we're kind of seeing the large companies become much more interested and starting to roll out products. So Amazon recognition is a big one. Again, that uses facial coding, I should say, to detect emotions in faces. So what that tells us here is that when we think about use of use of cameras in public spaces, that could be on streets, it could be in urban areas, it could be in shops. It's not just recognition technologies that are taking place. And I think sometimes when we think about kind of criticism and criticality around facial recognition, we're kind of forgetting something, that it's these issues and processes are not just about identification. They're also about the interest in identifying emotion and human intention. And I think sometimes that's missed. But that was Amazon. Microsoft, similarly, investing heavily in empathic technologies and are beginning to roll out products. And interestingly, they're hiring the startup people now. So whereas people like Dan McDuff, for example, who's over in Boston at Affectiva, some of which some of you may have heard of Affectiva, then they've been hired by Microsoft. So there's a consolidation, a monopolization around kind of the big corporates in emotion sensing technologies. In terms of what Microsoft's outputs are going to look like, it's going to look a little bit like this. So currently, many of you will be using email web clients produced by Microsoft. You need to think a little bit more broadly about what the workplace is going to look like. And certainly, kind of in part, that's going to involve tracking throughout your working day, quite literally from as you kind of pull into the car park, as you arrive at work, and as you leave in the evening. So it's going to involve biometrics in terms of identifying you, but also soft biometrics in terms of identifying physiological states to make inferences about your emotion. In terms of policing, I mentioned that a moment ago. Lots of work going on in policing, not just from the purposes of surveillance, but also to monitor officers. This for me is pretty interesting. It applies to kind of all frontline services, be that military, be it people in fire services, be it people working in ambulance services, to understand stress and affective states. For me, the police one is really interesting because that does, given it's a public service, in most places at least, raises questions of whether we should have access to that data if it's taxpayer funded. And then you start to dig down into questions of, well, how are the police responding to and whom are they responding to? So I did a lot of interviewing in the US in this regard. That was kind of during the period of Black Lives Matter and kind of police attacks on kind of black urban youth, and quite interesting in terms of kind of understanding reactivity and whether, the citizens have a right to demand that. Cars, automobiles, huge sector. Lots and lots of money floating around. So the startup community seems to be gravitating towards the car sector at the moment. Again, it's pretty interesting stuff. But the idea of having kind of cars that are, again, monitoring your physiological states, the idea is to deliver more personalized services, in terms of kind of music, in terms of understanding stress management, but connection is clearly there for the insurance industry as well. So watch this space. IBM, again, kind of really classic big old tech companies, also very much interested in emotion, this time in kind of use of text and words. Again, I think this becomes pretty interesting when we think about not just understanding the emotionality of text and words in terms of kind of sentiment, but also generative. So, for example, in relation to journalism, creative writing, in terms of using understanding of emotion in text to create as well as simply analyze. How am I doing for time, Katerina?
You're still absolutely okay. Still have approximately 10 minutes.
Okay. But yeah, NEC might be a little bit unfamiliar to you, but very big in the surveillance space, a huge Japanese tech company. And again, if you can, I appreciate it's a little bit detailed, this slide, but if you can see here, in terms of emotion, understanding of meaning, intent, and interpretation, these are very human-like qualities. They're not just about measuring. So the idea that we have kind of technologies trying to simulate kind of human means of understanding meaning and intent, the methodology is certainly debatable, very debatable, but the trajectory and the avenue and road of travel is very, very interesting, I think. Again, also note as well that NEC are very big in surveillance. Certainly in London, we're seeing the rollout of facial recognition in King's Cross area and kind of big urban areas where lots of people move through. So again, maybe interesting to talk about how things are in Italy and in other places, but certainly in London, we're seeing a lot of interest in use of facial recognition. So whereas only a few years ago, people who write for surveillance studies, such as myself, we're talking kind of creepy, scary terms about this stuff, and it's like, oh, it's here. But I said I was going to talk about advertising. So in relation to emotion sensing and advertising, what you see in front of you is, again, in London, what you see on top of you won't be able to say it's black tie, but essentially it's a camera there. It's a Microsoft Kinect camera. And what's occurring is that the camera is looking at the facial expression of the lady in the bus shelter on London's Oxford Street. And over time, the camera detects facial expressions, it collects information about those facial expressions, and the ad changes itself to elicit more positive reactions. So from the point of view of kind of urban experience, smart cities, et cetera, what we see is advertising optimizing itself, which is pretty interesting, I think. This was a case study, this was a trial by M&C Saatchi, but more and more kind of case examples are coming online by bigger companies. This is also London, Wimbledon, the tennis festival. Again, what Mindshare did, the advertising agency, they hooked up Wimbledon with facial coding cameras, but also using voice to understand the tone and emotionality of Wimbledon itself. So in essence, what that does is provide an augmented layer over the Wimbledon Tennis Festival, a datification of emotion, if you like, in urban and semi-private spaces, I guess. But yeah, interesting that they were using voice, facial coding, and they also hooked up around 20, 30 people or so with heart rate monitors as well to judge affective as well as emotional states. This is London now. Now, this is getting interesting because we're kind of seeing not just tests, but we're kind of seeing kind of the bigger rollout. So this is London's Piccadilly Circus. Essentially, it's the big advertising space within London. And again, those two dots there are where we have cameras. So we have cameras, again, registering the facial expressions of people as they move through urban spaces. Note there doesn't seem to be any legal discussion at this point. And for me, this is really interesting. And perhaps we've got quite a few lawyers here. It's like, well, where is the legal discussion? Hang on a second. How can you be collecting kind of certainly data that's of the body, therefore seemingly sensitive, in urban spaces, without any kind of notion of consent whatsoever? I'm just going to skip that one. But yeah, it was interesting because in essence, how the technologies work, they don't actually collect personal data. So the data that's collected by these systems cannot be linked back to an individual person. There is no singling out taking place, as GDPR tells us. I'm interested in the law. I follow it closely, but I'm not a lawyer. I guess I fall into that category of fake lawyer. There's a few of us around. I know, and there's more of us. So yeah, I'm one of those fake lawyers. But I did think, right, okay, I need to speak to some people who do know about this. So I went over to the European Commission. I talked to somebody very senior there over on the DG Connect side. And kind of basically I showed them, these are the systems, these are what they're doing, is this legal? And they wanted me to be really granular in terms of how I walked them through the systems, because they didn't want to make a pronouncement that was going to end up in a book or thereafter this conference if they were wrong. I basically say no, after seeing everything about how facial coding works in advertising, it does not require consent and it does not qualify as personal data. I thought that's just one person, so I need to talk to some more people. So I talked to a number of law firms. Nabarro, a big media law firm in the UK. Interestingly, he said consent is required because re-identification is possible. So basically this is kind of the mosaic argument where having enough kind of data points from enough data columns, you'll be able to work out who somebody is. So that's what he was advising his client. Timothy Pitt-Payne, again, very interested in surveillance technologies. He agreed with me, saying that legality hinges upon whether a person is singled out. Daniel Tench from Allswang was really interested. He does a lot of kind of journalism, does a lot of kind of telephoto lenses, those kind of questions, those kind of cases. But for him, dignity was key. And I think dignity is really key in terms of thinking back to Article 8, which doesn't really kind of hinge upon whether somebody's identifiable or not. It's a much more kind of normative stance, which of course informs our law. I'm going to skip this one as well. But what I'm going to do now is switch gears slightly just to talk a little bit about kind of UK citizens and their attitudes towards emotion detection. So I asked 5 questions, one around social media sentiment analysis, one around interactive movies, one around gaming, and one around voice assistants. But the one I'm going to focus on today is out-of-home advertising. So I'm going to put the question on the next slide. I want you to think about your own responses to this question. Advertising agencies, they developed outdoor ads equipped with cameras that scan onlookers' faces to work out emotions. If reactions are not positive, the ad changes itself, you get the idea. So the next slide is going to be 4 options. I'd like you to think which option represents your attitude to the use of emotion capture in advertising. So you've got 4 options there. 1, you're not okay with data about you being collected in this way. 2, you are okay with data collection about emotions as long as the information is anonymized and cannot be associated with you. Basically, it's not personal data. 3, you're okay, and you're okay for that to be connected with personal information. It's kind of the let it all hang out view. 4, don't know. So those are your 4 options. 1, not okay at all. 2, okay but anonymous. 3, okay to be connected with personal data. 4, don't know. Quick hands up for number 1. Interesting. Only 1 person. Oh, 2 people. Both the philosophers. Interesting. 2, you're okay if anonymized. Hands up. Interesting. So I'd say that's around kind of 30% of the room. 3, okay to have it connected with personal data. Hands up. 4, don't know. Okay, so this is a bit like my classroom where, students don't all put their hands up. But in short, basically we had overwhelming preference for number 2 and the 2 philosophical outliers. These were the findings. So in terms of UK citizens, across all demographics, in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of education levels, in terms of regions, around 2,000 people I asked, this is what they came back to with. Just under 50 hated the idea. Basically not okay with it in any way, shape or form. 33%, I'm kind of okay if not identifying. 8% let it all hang out. 4 didn't know. Age was the interesting variable because that began to change. That began to move. Younger people, not to say that they preferred. I'll come on to the reasons why in a second. But yeah, but in short, in terms of kind of 18 to 24s who just didn't like it at all, 34%. So the average overall is 50. For over 65s of people who hated the idea of emotion detection, 61. So there was kind of a real clear finding along the lines of age. There was no other kind of significant variable to segment the data by. It was only age that was of interest. So what I take away from that, in terms of kind of young people's willingness to kind of engage with kind of emotion sensing technologies, as long as it wasn't connected with personal data. Basically what that tells me is that young people are open to media experiences, and maybe that isn't such a huge revelation. But this leads to interesting questions about creepiness. So creepiness is basically about when social values misalign with technological capabilities. This in heart is the essence of conversation, and I note the Halloween theme there, 31st. So yeah, so creepiness, it's actually kind of a legal term as well, in terms of the misalignment of social values misaligned with technological capabilities. I think this is kind of where we are at the moment. So in terms of these technologies, are they ethical? They have to be understood in relation to context. Interestingly, Andrea is well involved some of the same work that I am with IEEE, understanding the use cases of these technologies and when emotion sensing is okay, because interacting with devices using emotion I don't see as innately problematic, but certainly kind of these technologies do have scope to be abused, and I personally am not that keen on it being used in an advertising context. But in terms of emotion sensing itself, yeah, I think it certainly does kind of have value. So I think I'll stop there because I really have gone for too much time. So yeah, I'll stop there. So thank you very much.